Hello, everybody. I'm Levi Littvay from Central European University's Department of Political Science, and I'm talking to Cai Wilkinson from Deakin University. Welcome, Cai. Thanks for talking to us.
Hi, Levi. Thanks for having me.
So we are here to talk about interpretive research, and then Cai is like an absolutely important addition to the team because us other conveners are very case-based and positivist quant, and Cai has been instrumental in leading us in the interpretive research. So I could not think of any better person to talk about this topic than Cai. So, all right. So, what is interpretivist research, and why should people who have not cared so far care?
Okay. As you'd expect from the name, interpretivist research is research that focuses on interpretations. So it's about the processes of meaning making and sense making that go on in terms of social processes and the social world in general. So the reason everyone should care about it is because we're actually living in a world that is always subject to interpretations, even if we think that it's made up of variables. Those variables are the result of your processes of interpretation that have already occurred. And the big difference, I think, between interpretivist approaches and positivist approaches is that we acknowledge that situatedness of the data and the situatedness of what we do, rather than having such established norms that they become invisible to us.
Okay, and okay, so where would one start? So what are the key underlying principles? So where would one start with this paradigm?
We're starting with the idea that the researcher is the central research tool, in terms of the first thing that happens is we interpret all of the data, all of the world around us. And then rather than seeing that as a process simply of extracting data, and then we put it mechanically through a process, we acknowledge the fact that how we interpret that data is going to be formed by our life experiences, who we are, where we've grown up, all the different contextual knowledge things that we know. So this is all the reference to positionality. And then rather than ignoring it and trying to be objective, and I'm going to use big scare quotes there because objectivity, I would argue, is not possible, we seek to interrogate those processes of meaning making and use that as a point of sometimes contact, sometimes pushing, to explain how we've reached particular interpretations. And by doing that, we also become aware of the interpretations that other people are making, so the people we're studying or interacting with. And hopefully through that, we can actually articulate how people have come to understand particular phenomena in particular ways. So a really good example of this would actually be, let's look at the US. You can do studies of voter behavior if you like. And then usually, particularly if you're more left-wing or if you're not a Trump supporter, people go, well, I just don't understand it. It's so illogical. People are voting against their own interests. Whereas if you took a more interpretivist approach, you'd come back and say, okay, but clearly Trump is meaning something quite different to these people and they're finding affinities with it. So let's talk to these people, let's study them, let's understand their world experience, and then see what insights we can gain. Where this is going to trip up for the positivists is that we do not come necessarily to a universalizable conclusion. And in fact, we may not come to what people would call findings at all, because very much the emphasis is not necessarily on explaining, the emphasis is on understanding. So coming back to why should people care about this, is because this process is actually happening all the time within positivist approaches, case-based approaches. It's simply the God view, or the view from nowhere, allows one to sweep it all under the carpet and ignore it in favor of formal methods and saying, well, I've done things in a particular stepwise fashion according to a protocol or according to an established process. And so I don't need to pay attention to all of this. And in fact, I'm just going to call it dirt. I'm going to call it bias. I'm going to call it all the things that make my research less scientific, when in fact, the idea of science is a meaning-making process itself. It just does it in a very different way.
Yeah, it's very funny that you brought up that example, because I plan to bring up like a personal experience, which really made me seriously think that there's something here, and we really should be paying attention. I don't know if I ever told you this, but I'm going to tell you now. In 2016, I've had this feeling of okay, it's been 10 years since I left the US,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm starting to not understand what's going on. It became problematic that I couldn't follow. And I was talking to, like, I studied in Nebraska, so conservatives all over. So there was never a problem talking to conservatives, but I was talking to the people who I knew were conservative and friends of mine, and they were not Trump supporters. They were Ted Cruz supporters, which made perfect sense to me. Ted Cruz made perfect sense. I understood Ted Cruz. I did not understand Trump. And I was thinking that, okay, well, it's Midwest Political Science Association time. I'm going to Chicago. It's April. So I'm going to have a Palmer House full of Americanists. So I can learn something here. I'm gonna grill everybody until I figure this out. And yeah, you can imagine what happened. Yeah. So the utter lack of understanding and reasonable explanations I was faced with were absolutely astonishing. And one of the things that struck me is not that nobody understands what's going on or has like these really simplistic explanations. Oh, this person's a racist, coming from a person who already published something saying the Tea Party is not racist. So, but still went back to the biases and the heuristics of, oh yeah, this is just racism. But you know, I needed something richer, like a richer explanation. And in the end, I started asking the question of, aren't you talking to Trump supporters? And the answer I got was, I've never spoken to a Trump supporter in my life, which really, really struck me, because when I was in Nebraska, I spent every minute I humanly could talking to conservatives nonstop. And I thought that was normal. I thought that yes, I thought this was normal. I was literally driving my friends crazy, and you know, at the bars, after the bars, in the diners, talking to the booth next to me. Americans are super friendly, so you can strike up a conversation anywhere, and just talking politics to everyone. And you know, my viewpoint was, hi, I'm not from around here. I study politics. I'm really interested in you. And long conversations of what people are thinking, sometimes terrifying, but you know, that I wanted to understand. And of course, that I took those conversations, and that informed my research. That was always the foundation of my research. And talking to Dvora Yanov, who is also an interpretivist researcher, very prominent, and also an instructor at the Method School, she was telling me that I was doing research, and I thought I was just doing background work. And that was when, at this Midwest conference, it was when it clicked that maybe this critique is not a straw man. I always thought it was a straw man, that we don't understand. So I don't know. What do you think about this story? So
yeah, I think it's exactly the way it happens. Is, you know, I'll come at it a bit from the other angle. Is I came late to political science, having been an area studies person. You know, which is not quite a methodological, but certainly half the time it does feel like you're claiming a lot of legitimacy based on language, meaning that you can count cabbages in 2 languages. And coming into political science, for me, it was very obviously, it was a culture, it was a discipline. And to get all Foucaultian for a minute, disciplines discipline us in how we're supposed to see the world. And so for me, it was really obvious that there was something going on in terms of, it told us to see with a particular lens, and I was very conscious of what was being excluded from that. And so my job was almost the opposite to yours, which was, how do I make this work while still managing to do research? And a lot of it was then about, I've got all this knowledge. I've been talking to these people in Russia, in Kyrgyzstan, everywhere else for years. And I know there's something important about that. How then do I systematize it, or turn it from being anecdata and just having those random conversations to actually bring it into a formal research design and in a way that makes sense, rather than being told, okay, you've had all these conversations, but now forget it, draw a hard line and say, this is where my research starts, these are the bounds of my research, and this is what I'm not going to do, but I'm not even going to talk about it. Despite the fact that, you know, as your example's just shown, those experiences of talking to people and the ideas it gives you and the ways that it shapes your thinking, and then the questions that you ask and the project that you take on are so clearly influential. So the only way that I could do it, having tried to be a real political scientist, and in fact the Midwest Political Science Association, a panel there was the firm end of that attempt to be a political scientist for me, because it was so traumatic. It was then, I knew what I wanted to do but didn't have a language for it, and interpretivism was then, actually speaking of Devorah, it was taking her course at the first ever ECPR method summer school that gave me the language to be able to explain what I was doing and to formalize it. So it was almost going the opposite way. And that resolved that tension between how I was experiencing the world, and particularly with Kyrgyzstan, and how I was seeing people talk about it, and what I was actually experiencing.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. So I mean, the long-standing tradition in this field that the Methodists are doing, and this can't be taught. This is changing, fortunately, because we're working at a method school, both of us.
Yep.
How is that transformation happening? And so this can be learned, right?
It can definitely be learned. I mean, you know, and I think in that sense, it's a different way of thinking, and it puts different questions on the table for us to consider. And I mean, I'd argue that regardless of the sort of research or the paradigms that we belong to, the disciplines we affiliate ourselves with, at the end of the day, all of us want to do good, robust, insightful research. You know, that's the aim. And so it's a question of how can we achieve that, and how do we, particularly when we hit problems, so you know, when we find that the explanations we've got only take us so far, or when we've got something shifted and we don't know quite how to respond to it. I think fake news would be a really interesting example. How then can we go further and deal with the puzzles or the things that aren't making sense to us? And I think for me, that's where positivist approaches can get us so far. But the messier it gets, the more positivist approaches tend to struggle because they're very rigid. Whereas interpretivist approaches, because they do follow the thing, because they are responsive, because they look at the mess and they say, that's interesting, rather than, oh, let's not go there. They give us more purchase on difficult problems. And in that sense, they can help us work it through. Even if it's just thinking it through and finding a different way to approach it, and we don't go wholesale interpretivist. So if
you were to give an advice for a positivist who would be willing to entertain this, I am personally. I still struggle with I mean, the paradigms are so different. Can meaningful mixed method research be done?
I think it depends on the questions you're asking. I know we've had this debate with Erin before. I think it depends very much how much you take from interpretivism. I think if you want to go wholesale, full-on ontological, epistemological interpretivism, then probably you're going to have some issues. But that's not to say that interpretivists don't use numbers. It's just we're interested in how numbers produce meaning, or how metrics produce meaning, rather than simply saying, great, I've got my numbers. Because my first question with numbers is, okay, so what? Unless you give me the context, I'm going to be a little bit dubious.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think there's something about some of the underlying principles of particularly interpretivist ethnographic work, which, particularly if we're talking about doing research with real life people, are incredibly useful in terms of recognizing that we are actually co-constructing the data as we go, and that we do influence it, and we cannot completely get rid of those biases. So, you know, back to the positionality debate, if you go to Kyrgyzstan and interview 6 people, and I go to Kyrgyzstan and interview the same 6 people, even if we ask exactly the same questions, chances are we're going to have a slightly different experience. Now, we can focus on the similarities and say, yeah, broadly, they all said this about parliamentary democracy, or they all said this about bride kidnapping. But within that, there's also going to be a fundamentally different way of relating to people, simply because of your nationality, your gender, your age, all these other things. And we can actually gain insights from looking at those and saying, well, what are the dynamics at play? Where are the points of contact? And importantly, rather than simply saying, great, we've got 6 mentions of this, we can also say, well, actually, the way they talked about it was different. So we can look at how meaning is constructed, the broader context, and we can look for the bits that don't quite add up, the dissonances, the quirks, exactly as you mentioned with the Trump supporters, the things that don't make any sense at all, if you're thinking rationally. And so it tells us that something else is going on. And so then we explore that further. And if we want to, we can then take that into the writing process and actually make that part of the accounts. Alternatively, it could just have been, it's a good check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay. So let me just brainstorm here, because I'll throw on the table some of my problems with the paradigm, and maybe you can help me through it. So I know this first one is unfair, because this is a problem everywhere. But jargon, it really feels like this literature is speaking another language that I don't understand, and I'm always struggling to understand. I'm always like seeking out work that explains it in language that I understand. And like, I mean, even words we have used in this conversation that I am now comfortable with, like co-generated information, and we didn't talk about reflexivity, but maybe we could say a few words about that. That even the word meaning making, though that's almost clear, is there's just a plethora of jargon that I don't understand, and I wonder if this is something that can be overcome. And I know there's a lot of jargon in positivist research and hypothesis testing. So I know it's unfair, but I feel like it's counterproductive that we don't speak the same language.
I'd argue the opposite. I think your awareness that it is a separate language is absolutely crucial. Simply because it is a different way of being and seeing the world, and fundamentally it does run all the way down. At least it can do. So understanding that it's not just about the questions that are being asked that are different, it's not just the languages. I think it's something deeper. I think it's probably the easy way to look at it is in terms of what are the criteria that we use to assess positivist work versus interpretivist work. Now, for the positivist ones, we know that it's about internal validity, external validity, reliability, objectivity. Those are the basic criteria any researcher is going to have to meet. It is simply not possible to apply those to interpretivist work. We've got to look at the entire research world differently. So instead of internal validity, we have credibility. So have we given the reader sufficient information to actually assess, does this sound credible? Where's the data to support it? Where's the evidence? Transferability. So we're not going for the universalizing, but we are still recognizing that there are some things that may be important and can be relevant to other contexts. Dependability. So is this a consistent account? Is this something that has got sufficient what we'd call thickness? So different sorts of data being brought into conversation with each other to meet that criteria. And then confirmability. Can you trace how the research has happened? This goes back to the field notes, all of the process of actually reaching your conclusions. And that has to be documented. But I think it's important that it is seen as another language. It would be the same otherwise it's one of the reasons why the US and the UK are two nations divided by a common language, is even the same things, but they're fundamentally thinking differently. And that's what we need to get at with these different paradigms.
Okay. That helps. At least it helps me. Okay, second problem. So everything I've read, Dvora and Perry Shea Schwartz's book on interpretivist reasoning is something I assign in my research design classes, because whenever I feel like I can assign a whole book on this, it's very helpful. But like very early on, there's a question of how does a research question come about through this abductive process of I'm going to wander in this circle and stumble onto the research question. How do you write a research proposal? How do you write a research grant if you expect to stumble onto the question later? How do you do it?
The idea that you kind of are completely naive, go to a new field, and then miraculous questions emerges it's one of those, I think it's one of those devices we talk about, because it's in such stark contrast to the idea that you've got one question, you focus on it right from the start. The
Yes.
reality is I think all of us, positivist or otherwise, have ideas or questions that are of particular interest before we start formal research. And so when it comes to interpretivist work and what we're doing, the aim is to allow the conclusions to emerge from the field of data. So what that often means is we can give you a puzzle. We can say, hey, there's something interesting going on here. There's a problem. Or let's go back to our Trump supporters. You know, you get to the point where you're going, well, all of the explanations I've heard don't make any sense. So I need to do some more research and find out what's going on. And you might even write it and say, there's some provisional hypotheses, some provisional ideas about what's actually happening. You know, could this be due to identity affiliations, or could this be because people have got anti-establishment views, or because they've experienced hard times over the last 10 years and they feel left out by the democratic machine that's gone centrist? Take your pick. But rather than say, these are what I'm going to test for, they stay in the back of your mind as ideas or hunches. I think hunches is a nice word, because they're often ones that we don't have any evidence to support them yet, that we're going to test. So in terms of how you're going to write that for your research proposal, you will go in and you'll say, hey, there's something interesting going on here, and there's a gap because people have done these. No one's actually talked to Trump supporters. We've seen a lot about voting behaviors this way and that, and we've got the economic analysis, but this still doesn't make sense. So there's your gap. Then it's like, how am I going to investigate it? There's been a variety of different ideas proposed, but none of these fully hold true. Plus we've got the usual problems of correlation and causation not being the same thing. So rather than go and try and test these in an environment, I'm going to go to the field, continue to talk to people, and then through an iterative process of engagement, deep reading of documents, artifacts, and then reflections, which includes reflections on your own interpretations, your political views, and so on. You will aim to look for patterns of meaning making and patterns that are happening. So a lot of people mentioning, industrial decline, or a lot of people mentioning Hillary Clinton. So then that gives you a way to start to identify ways in which people are thinking that you can then systematize through continued interrogation with it. So I don't think any of us actually start with no idea of what we're going to find. The difference is rather than go and test something directly, we're looking to explore it and prevent a premature jump to conclusions. And we're still trying to be as sensitive as possible to the idea that we haven't yet found the most compelling or the most persuasive answers. And when we do find them, rather than say, that's it, we want to say, okay, that's great, we've got one of them, but it's probably more complex than that. Now let's tease it out.
Yeah.
So you can still have all the systematicity, you can still have all the rigor, and you can still actually set yourself quite a very clear puzzle, but you're also recognizing that you don't know everything and that this is always going to be a partial view, and you want to maintain that openness to potential surprises or being taken in a slightly different direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, no, thanks. That helps. So okay, so maybe we're coming to the end of this conversation. So there was this encyclopedia entry on
Yes,
interpretivism, which it kind of concluded in an interesting thought that the value of objective truth, which is a difficult concept for interpretivists, is going to be increasing in the post-truth world, where just to be able to generate some objective truths scientifically will be much more, I mean, will be very important, because there are so many fake news. You brought up fake news already. There are so many different readings of things in the post-truth world that this is going to be important, interesting, and relevant, and a challenge for interpretive research. So you brought up fake news in a positive context earlier. So I'm really curious what you think about this.
Yep. Yeah. My sense is, I mean, fake news, I think, has been a massive problem, because it does feed into the idea that it's just a question of telling a better story and whatever you can persuade people of, which is one of the slightly unfair, in my view, charges that's often leveled at interpretivist research, and especially ethnographic research, like you're just telling stories about other people's lives. I think there is something about the value of objective truth, but what worries me is the fact that, going back to my previous comment, that there is no such thing as objectivity in terms of that idea of what is valuable, and the sort of data and the sort of knowledge that is valuable is fundamentally socially constructed. And it may be that we say we are going to see particular sources of information, traditionally journalists, not anymore, as more legitimate, and therefore we assume that we can trust it rather than having to engage in this process of critical thinking, evaluation, and understanding the provenance of the data. So we don't, effectively it's a shortcut. It lets us go through in things without having to go, I really don't know who to believe anymore because I haven't done all of my critical thinking tests and I don't know the full background. And in fact, even before fake news came about, one of the issues with the internet has been the mass availability of information means that it's very difficult to actually know what to trust. Now, speaking to PhD students, academics, we all go, well, surely everyone knows the difference between a respectable newspaper and a good one and other sources. But the reality is the vast majority of people are not going to, plus people are not using the internet for rigorous research. They're looking at either to stay informed in a general sense, or more people are using it to look at pictures of cats and things that make them feel good, which may or may not include the cats. So it's very much, it's coming back to saying this is fundamentally about the politics of knowledge production that come through, of what forms of knowledge production do we see as legitimate, and interpretivism gives us a way to actually interrogate that and say, okay, traditionally it's been journalists, but then actually those standards have changed, the way in which the journalistic industry has changed, the political economy of everything has changed, and I think that's probably one of the key ones. And so now it is more incumbent on us to know the provenance of what we are reading, the news that we are consuming. And that speaks to one of the fundamental things about the way in which we envisage data. And this nicely segues into the other article I sent you about why the data is never raw, which is data is not a natural thing. It's not something that we go around and stumble on, pick up a block of, and then magically put into our theories. It's already been partially cooked, partially processed, and we need to be more attentive than ever to what those processes are and who's done the cooking. Because particularly in the case of fake news, we need to know that people are actually doing it in a particular way and they're willing to speak up about that and the culture that they've come from. So I think it is going to be a question of what news is valued. I would, however, still very much question the idea that it's about objective news or data being particularly valued. It probably will be simply because that's what's easier, and metrics work that way. So it's all these things saying, oh, it is bad, but it's better than nothing. But I think really the lesson to take away is that we need to interrogate far more deeply the processes by which news is created and circulated, in the same way as we expect our research to be done rigorously, and we want to be able to uncover it. So in that sense, we've seen initiatives like the Data Archive Transparency Project, DART. We've seen the idea of repositories and making data sets clear. It's like you can make it clear, but you've still got the process of interpretation. Yeah. And unless you do just replicate, and we've seen the crisis of replicability in psychology in particular, I think it was something like 60% of studies were not actually replicable.
I think it's less, it's the half, 48%, something like that.
Yeah, I think it's in excess of half, and certainly some areas it goes particularly high, as you'd expect, because you're dealing with people, and people are messy and unpredictable.
Well, but also, there are some problems there.
There's many problems, but it comes back to that we need to be paying more attention to the processes by which knowledge formation, data generation, all these things are happening. And I think that's where paying attention to the process rather than just presenting the findings and being more conscious about it. So this is the reflexivity of knowing what decisions you've made at each stage can be a very useful device to get us closer to that. The downside is it takes more time, it takes more energy, and it also means that papers tend to be longer, and that doesn't fit very well with contemporary academia. So I'm not saying it's the easy answer, but I think it is certainly doing the work is one way that we can help ensure that we've got robust information and research.
Cool. All right, recommendations. So I already mentioned Dvorianov's and Perry Shea Schwartz's. I don't remember the order of the authors. Book on it's like an introduction to interpretive research. It's a great book if somebody wants a methods review. Yep, yeah, I can't see it, but hold it back.
Can't, I don't think. Oh no, there we go.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, that book, it's a great book. That would be one recommendation I would give. And let me just put two more out there that helped me in my thinking and everything. And one is Kathy Kramer Walsh's book. I can't remember the title, but it's on Wisconsin voters, rural Wisconsin voters. Yeah. So
she did go and talk to Trump supporters.
Yes. Well, before they were Trump supporters, they were Scott Walker supporters at the time. I believe. Yeah. So so that one, and probably Scotchpole and Williams's book on the Tea Party would be a good example. That's also very anthropological and very interpretivist in its form. That helped me in my. I mean, you can obviously guess what my research interest is based on this. What would you have a couple recommendations for people?
Sure. I've just reached back to the shelves to grab the books. I'll start off with the other methods one. These are actually all in the Routledge series on interpretive methods that Dvorak and Perry edit. If anyone is doing talking to people, so interviewing, then Leanne Fuji's book is hugely worth a read. Even if you don't take on the relational approach fully, it's incredibly useful for understanding how to do an interview that doesn't feel like a data extraction exercise. So interviews should be something that's enjoyable for both parties, ideally. You know, and it shouldn't feel like just running through a list of questions. Tell me your answer to this. It's not an interrogation. And I think that one's a really useful one for keeping it humane and giving people a lot of practical tips as well. So highly recommended for that. The other one, and this is one I use for my advanced ethnographic methods course, is Timothy Patriarch's Among Wolves. It's actually written as a play. So it's completely not orthodox. It's probably something which people are going, weird. But it interrogates, it covers all of the big debates about particular ethnography, but from a very interpretivist stance. And each act covers different aspects of it. So it starts out with the idea of people are convening for an ethnographic trial. And then there's the idea that there's an invisibility potion. And should ethnographers actually just take this invisibility potion, and then they really would be objective because we're getting rid of the researcher in the field and they can observe everything. So it's a really interesting interrogation that is thought-provoking and is a great introduction to sort of ethnography and political ethnography.
We should do a reading of that in at the method school. That would be fun to do.
We totally should. We need we'll need 8 people though, and this is one of the problems with it, is because it covers 8 different ethnographies as well. But so still, it's a perfect Christmas read, really. So look that one up. And then if people are looking at what can ethnography do within political science in particular, we tend to come back to questions of power. And then, so we'd have to mention Ed Schatz's, that's not going well, we'll stick with that, political ethnography. It is an edited collection. Some of the chapters won't suit people as much, but it's got great chapters by Lisa Woodine, and it's also got a really good chapter by Dvorak at the end of it about how to read ethnographic work as well, and the idea of what are we seeking to achieve when we're writing in more interpretivist ways. So the move that goes from telling your research journey to giving an account of your research that makes sense to other people, because it isn't just to give people a blow-by-blow account, because that's really not very helpful.
Cool. Well, thank you. All right. So is there anything else we should hit on this topic before we close?
No, I think that probably covers the main things. I think it's be willing to go and listen to yourself and use your senses as well. Don't ignore what you're experiencing in your everyday life, the questions that occur to you. This is very much, it's about humane social science research, and that recognizing that not everything can be reduced down to a variable. So let's explore that complexity and make use of it rather than ignoring it.
Cool. That's a very good closing thought. So thank you, Cai, for joining and talking to us about interpretive research. And I'm going to say bye to everybody. Bye. Say bye.
Bye.